Hello and welcome to another episode of the Enter the Bible podcast, where you can get answers or at least reflections on everything you wanted to know about the Bible but were afraid to ask. I'm Katie Langston.
And I'm Kathryn Schifferdecker. And today we have as our guest speaker and Bible expert, Professor Cameron Howard, who is a professor of Old Testament at Luther Seminary, a colleague and friend. So we're excited to have you here, Cameron. We've got some listener questions for you.
And one of the OG hosts, right, Cameron? You're one of the OG hosts of the Enter the Bible podcast?
Well, yeah, I guess
like years
actually
ago?
I took over for Kathryn at one point. Yeah, so I was back in the day, hosting this.
It's awesome.
Yeah, thanks for remembering that, Katie. I had forgotten. Yeah, you are one of the original hosts in the previous incarnation of this podcast a few years back. So thanks for joining us again, Cameron.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, good to have you. So we have a rather long listener question. And again, a reminder to the listeners that if you have a question about the Bible, please go to the enterthebible.org website and click on Ask a Question or whatever that tab that it comes up right away when you go on the website, and you can submit a question. We don't promise that we will address all the questions, but we try to address as many of them as we can, and sometimes we'll combine similar questions. So this one talks about Second Chronicles, or First and Second Chronicles, and the listener is looking at the entry on Enter the Bible about Second Chronicles, in which the author, Professor Mark Throntveit, talks about comparisons of Greek versions of Samuel and the Dead Sea Scrolls and Second Chronicles. And the listener wants to know which is the correct reading, the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Septuagint, and is it about the Dead Sea Scrolls being in Hebrew and the Greek loses some meaning, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a question specifically about an entry on Enter the Bible, but we're kind of opening it up a bit to address two things. I think one is just to talk a bit about First and Second Chronicles, which Cameron has spent some time in, and to talk about how they compare, or what they are really, what is the genre of First and Second Chronicles. And then to talk a bit about this idea of, or this issue of different manuscripts. So Hebrew and Greek manuscripts, it has to do with the Dead Sea Scrolls. It has to do with the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible called the Septuagint. So we just want to, it's really too much for one podcast episode, but we want to at least start to address those sorts of questions. So Cameron, let's start with that thing about First and Second Chronicles in particular. Like, how would you define those or describe those to someone who's not familiar?
Well, this is a great question from the listener. First of all, I'm really excited about the detail that they've been studying. First and Second Chronicles, or I'll refer to them usually just as Chronicles, because they were originally one book that got split apart due to length, probably. But
like the Twilight books,
just like
the last movie of the Twilight series. It's exactly like that.
Right.
Or you could say the 3-part Hobbit movie, but that's a different matter.
Ooh, no, that was a bad artistic choice. Anyway, go on.
Go ahead, sorry.
But we digress.
So, Chronicles, if you've ever tried to read through Chronicles, you've probably noticed that the first 9 chapters of Chronicles are genealogy. So 9 chapters of genealogies. And then it picks up with the death of Saul and retells a lot of the history that we also find in Samuel and Kings. First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, also once each. One book.
Yes.
But Chronicles is different in that it leaves out a lot of the more kind of salacious or maybe even interesting details from the life of David, for example.
Unlike the Twilight movies. Go on.
Right. And it's very focused on David, but not on David as the sort of complicated personality that we find in Samuel Kings, but rather David's kingship, David's establishment of, for example, the guilds of temple singers, David's authorization of things that were going on after David's death, and in fact, after the exile. So Chronicles is retelling Samuel and King's stuff from a particular very pro-Davidic point of view, but also from the Persian period of biblical history. So after the exile, probably really the 4th century is when Chronicles is put together. And so a lot of what it's doing...
BC, just to
BCE, yes.
Yeah, BCE, yes.
The 300s. And so in order to kind of comment on perhaps the way that temple worship is happening in the 4th century, or to provide authorization for who gets to be a priest or who's in a particular job. So on the one hand, it is kind of rehashing some of the earlier stuff that we read in Samuel Kings, but on the other hand, it's also probably commenting, sometimes in ways we don't even yet understand, about a later era. It was written after Samuel and Kings, and it is probably not only commenting on the past, but also on its present.
So how would you compare this to a history textbook, say, or a biography of Alexander Hamilton or whatever? What
Right.
what are the aims of Chronicles?
Does it contain elements of rap and hip hop?
There is a kind of mashup actually of a
Really?
psalm of Psalms in First Chronicles. Yeah,
I love it.
A kind of reworking. So we
The
could
Hamilton
look
of
at
our
that
time,
in another
of its
podcast.
time.
The mashup, the musical mashup in First Chronicles. But so we know that there's no such thing as disinterested history. Everybody who wants to talk about the past has a particular agenda, has a particular point of view. But in modern history writing, there is at least a sort of effort toward objectivity, or toward being very transparent about what one's agenda might be, in as much as it can be known, for sort of telling the things that happened. And I think the chronicler is not simply trying to tell the things that happened, but is trying to interpret the things that happened through a particular theological viewpoint. So he doesn't, and I say he because I think it's overwhelmingly the possibility is that the chronicler, the one who wrote Chronicles, was male. But we could just say I'll try to just substitute the chronicler. The chronicler is as I said, we don't entirely know the motivations of the chronicler, but we know what some of the chronicler's interests are. So first of all, the sort of legitimacy and authority and just overall greatness of the kingship of David.
Sure.
And all the stuff that sort of extra stuff is attributed to David, and David's establishing it to kind of give it authority. But the chronicler is also interested in all of Israel, the kind of unity of Israel. This phrase, all Israel, comes up time and time again. All Israel gathered at the, coronation, as it were, of David. So there are and so the way that biblical scholars are going to try to discern what the chronicler is up to is by comparing with Samuel and Kings. So what gets put in, what gets added to, what gets left out. So just a couple of examples. The story of David and Bathsheba is completely absent from Chronicles, even though Bathsheba is referred to. Solomon, the successor to David, son of David and Bathsheba, is referred to. But those kinds of personal details are left out. Michal, who is Saul's daughter, there's a whole episode in Samuel where David dances before the ark dressed in only a loincloth, and Michal looks with disdain on David's doing that. That is not in there, but there is just sort of one kind of expression of disdain about Michal, but she's not even listed as one of David's wives in the genealogy. She doesn't have a child with David. But the chronicler doesn't like Saul, it seems, or wants to really emphasize how great David is over Saul. And so it seems like the little detail that is included about Michal is probably just to say, look at Saul, he's terrible. And
right.
So,
and David is the best and Saul is the worst. Yeah.
Right. You can sum up, especially First Chronicles in David is the best. That was a very good summary of First Chronicles.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So in that sense, it reminded me what you were saying, Cameron, it reminded me a little of the Gospels, right? Like the Gospels are all telling the story of Jesus from a different perspective. And so when you read the Gospels, it's super interesting to see where they're the same. And then it's maybe even more interesting to see where they're different and see where each of the different Gospel writers are, what they're trying to emphasize in their context or whatever. So this feels like a practice that's like pretty good Bible reading 101, kind of paying attention to those sorts of differences and, comparing and contrasting, especially when you're getting the same basic story, like retold a couple of different times.
Right. And then, go ahead, Kathryn.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I wanted to go back to a point you made earlier too, Cameron, when you first started talking about Chronicles, that the chronicler is probably writing in the Persian period, 4th century BCE. By the way, BCE, same as BC. But before the common era now is the more common way to talk about it. Anyway, so I'm just going to say he, because you're right, it's probably he, is almost as concerned, or perhaps just as concerned with his present context and talking about, kind of addressing the people of his generation and context, as much as he's interested in, retelling the story of David and all Israel. So it's just, I think, worth emphasizing that point that like the Gospels as well, right? Many of, some of which address issues that didn't come up in Jesus' time but came up later, like church discipline. Right. The chronicler talks about issues that come up later in Israel's history, not necessarily in the period of history that he's addressing.
And right. like Hamilton, the musical, right? Like Hamilton, the musical is very much a product of the 21st century, reflecting back on the history. No, seriously, but making a commentary on present day. Mm-hmm. I think we should call this episode Chronicles, not as boring as you've been told.
That's a good title. Yeah,
that's good. I like that.
Like, as someone who has spent some time in Chronicles, I want to say that on the one hand, there is a lot of boring stuff in Chronicles, but there are a lot of interesting little glimmers of things that come up in Chronicles that are really, really different. And so one of those things is that, to figure out the chronicler's agenda or what it might have been, we want to look not only at Samuel Kings, because it appears that the chronicler, and this gets to the listener's question, the other part of the question, the chronicler was looking not only at the existing text of Samuel Kings or a kind of earlier manuscript version of it, perhaps, but also other sources.
Yeah.
that we do not have access to today. So biblical scholars will be trying to figure out, well, this part overlaps with Samuel King's. This part doesn't. Did the chronicler make that up, or did the chronicler have some other text in front of them to read and to take from? Certainly there are lots of references to these hypothetical other texts in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, like the Chronicles of Edo the seer, or the annals of the kings of Israel and Judah, or there are the kind of these references, almost not quite footnotes, but a little bit like that, saying, if you want to read more about this, you should go to such and such a text that now does not exist. And so scholars try to figure out, were there other texts that the chronicler was using? What did the chronicler make up? And so when it comes to looking at versions of Chronicles from the Dead Sea Scrolls and from the Septuagint, which is the old Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, it was begun in the 3rd century BCE and finished in the 2nd century. From Hebrew to Greek. So scholars will compare all these different old manuscripts and look at where they overlap. And so I think that on the Enter the Bible entry, when the question is which one is correct, what's happening there is that scholars are putting those side by side, Samuel King's Chronicles, and then from the Hebrew tradition, and then the Greek tradition of those texts, and then Dead Sea Scrolls manuscripts of those texts, which would have been Hebrew, and seeing, okay, if three out of these 4 match up, what's probably happened is that the 4th one, the outlier, has done its own editing, because there's a lot of continuity in the texts, and then when you see something deviate from that continuity, it's probably that person has innovated on that existing textual tradition.
Yeah.
So there are places where, for example, Chronicles and the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint will line up but be different than Samuel King's. So maybe Samuel King's there is either looking at a different manuscript or doing its own editorializing. So there's a lot of kind of give and take in terms of trying to figure out what is the original of any given biblical text.
Right, because one of the, I guess, like I'm intrigued that the person who asked the question said what's correct, and they put correct in in parentheses or in quotation marks, scare quotes or whatever, because I don't know how you answer that question, like what's quote unquote correct. I don't know how meaningful that question is, but it does sound like, Cameron, you're saying there's a bias toward trying to find the earliest.
Right. I think there's always a search for the quote unquote original, which is such originals are utterly lost to us.
Yep.
And whoever did the first composition of any particular text, that text had to be copied by scribes over time.
Right.
There was no printing press, there were no Xerox machines, like it was just hand copying.
Right.
And the scribal enterprise of copying text was not just about duplicating, but it was also a creative process about updating and retelling. And we can really see that well in Samuel King's and Chronicles. It's like, here's some of the same stories. We want to, on the one hand, preserve tradition, this tradition about David, but we want to tell that story in a way that comments on later days, right? And so that would mean lifting up some details and letting other details recede.
Yeah.
It seems important to me to note that it's not like that's not sinister.
Right.
Right? Or
right.
I think in maybe some of our more, let's say, fundamentalist leaning, traditions, Christian traditions or whatever, there is this sort of like, we have to find the infallible originals or the closest to the originals or the original manuscripts or whatever. And I think I would speak for all three of us. You can correct me if I'm wrong, in saying that that's not actually the most interesting question, like what's the quote unquote right one, but it's more about understanding how the text comes to us and understanding that it goes through these interpretive kind of experiences like Hamilton, which could be canonized if you ask me, that that ultimately helps us understand like what the nature of scripture is, and even how we're invited then to also take these ancient texts and reinterpret them in light of our in light of the present day. Certainly if we're going to call the Bible a living word, that has to be part of the equation, and that's actually built into the very nature and fabric of the text itself. So that feels like something that it's actually kind of important that we understand that, like in our own lives as we read and study the Bible and want to see how it speaks to us today.
Yeah, I would agree with that, especially if you're talking about interpretation. I think I would want to distinguish between interpretation on the one hand and the kind of manuscript tradition that Cameron was referencing earlier, right? Like we're not changing the text itself at this point. There was a time when there was some, flexibility in that, and that's I think what Cameron was talking about. But certainly that reflects different interpretive streams, and we're invited to continue to interpret this living word. I just want to add, and this might be too much in the weeds, but I just opened my NRSV translation Bible to look at First Chronicles, and just found one example of what you were talking about with the manuscript traditions, Cameron. In now I'm going to lose it. Oh, in First Chronicles 17:5. The text that's translated says, "I have lived in a tent and a tabernacle," but then there's a little footnote, and at the bottom of the page it says that's actually the Greek, but the Hebrew says, "But I have been from tent to tent and from tabernacle," which sounds like just bad grammar. So anyway, when you see in footnotes, especially if you're in a scholarly edition of a scholarly translation, you're going to sometimes see footnotes that have GK, meaning the Greek, that is the the Septuagint, the Old Greek translation, or Vulgate VG, which is the Latin translation. So these are footnotes that are mostly interesting to scholars and tend to not be very significant differences, but because it's a scholarly edition, they're making sure that there may be a slightly different reading or a slightly different text of that particular book or that particular verse. Anyway, this is all to say lots of hands, lots of people involved in the passing down of Scripture, certainly the composition and the editing of Scripture, but also the passing down of Scripture, because as I think Cameron already said, there were no Xerox machines, there were no scanning of these manuscripts, so they had to be passed down by handwritten scrolls on animal hides. Primarily. So that's where we have these slightly different readings, mostly trivial differences. But anyway, thank you, Cameron. That may be more than our listener bargained for. But it was really helpful to talk about Chronicles, which is an often neglected book or books of the Bible. As you say, there's things more interesting there than perhaps we understand at face value, though there's also lots of genealogies which are not particularly attention grabbing.
Exciting. Sure.
Do you know the prayer of Jabez is in 1 Chronicles 4? That was very famous for a while. That's buried in the middle of the genealogy. There are little things like that, glimmers, I like to call them,
Little
in the
glimmers. I love
weeds, as we say.
That's awesome.
Well, thank you to our listener for that question, and thanks so much, Cameron, for addressing it. That was a big and complicated question, so we really appreciate your time in doing that.
My pleasure.
Thanks to our listeners for listening to this episode of the Enter the Bible podcast. Get high-quality courses, commentaries, resources, videos, and reflections at enterthebible.org, and be sure to rate and review us on your favorite podcast app. And if you're so moved, share the podcast with a friend. Thanks for joining us.